So there were a total of 25 questions in the quiz, and I'm going to make just 5 videos, and each of the videos is going to contain an explanation for 5 questions only. So I'm not going to be reading out the questions that you can do for yourself. I'm just going to be providing an explanation as to which answer is correct and why. Here we need to see whether or not this statement is correct, that is whether contracts can be classified into 4 main types on the basis of performance. Now this is clearly false, because if you refer to the slides where I have mentioned how we can classify contracts on the basis of performance, and there you can see that even though there are subcategories, for example for executory contracts we do have 2 further subcategories, that is unilateral and bilateral contracts, but broadly speaking there are just 2 types of contracts, that is executed and executory contracts, when we classify contracts on the basis of performance. And one piece of advice that I'd like to give here is that in this particular statement the key word was broadly. So if I had not included that term, then the statement would have been correct. But remember that whenever in an exam situation you're given a true and false situation question, it may seem pretty straightforward on the face of it, that is apparently the statement might seem to be true, but you always need to stay on the lookout for certain terms that might make that statement false. And certain terms that you should always be very careful to analyze are never, mostly, necessarily, and so on. Okay, so the next question asked for which of the following is not an essential element of a valid contract. This one was pretty straightforward, but surprisingly quite a few of you got this wrong. If you refer to the slides, you can see that free consent, capacity to contract, and certainty, these 3 are clearly mentioned in the slides as essentials of the contract. So there's no way that these 3 are not counted as essentials. Therefore, the answer was D, that is none of the above. Yeah, so there's really nothing more to it. Okay, so question 3 says there are 2 possible ways to classify contracts, just as there are only 2 possible ways to classify companies. Well, once again, this is clearly false, because first of all, recall that there is no real connection between classifying contracts and classifying companies. And even if we do attempt to compare the classification of companies with the classification of contracts, even then, the first half of the statement is clearly incorrect. Because once again, if you refer to the slides, you can see that there are clearly 3 possible ways to classify contracts. And just in case you don't remember, so the first one is on the basis of formation, the second one is on the basis of enforceability, and the third one is on the basis of performance. Okay, now coming to the 4th question, which says that classifying contracts on the basis of formation. Well, there are definitely 3 types of contracts when we classify contracts on the basis of formation. Once again, a very easy question. A quick reference to the slides would have given you the answer, that this statement is indeed true. So we have express contracts, implied contracts, and quasi contracts when we classify contracts on the basis of formation. Okay, next we have question 5. It says that an implied contract is the same as a quasi contract. Well, the first half of the statement is obviously incorrect. Let's read what the other half says. Since both contracts are not concluded expressly. Now this is admittedly slightly tricky, because to the extent that implied and quasi contracts are both contracts that are not concluded expressly, so to this extent they definitely do differ with express contracts in that sense. But just because an implied contract is not an express contract and a quasi contract is also not an express contract, does that mean that each of these is exactly the same? So think about it logically. If they were one and the same thing, then why would we have separate categories for implied contracts and quasi contracts? If the only difference between each of these was that they are not concluded expressly and there is no further difference, then both of these should be the same categories and we would not have separate categories. So this statement is partially correct. However, you need to remember that in true and false questions, one way to set a tricky question is simply to make one half of the statement correct, while the other half is clearly not correct or is partially correct. So in short, other than the fact that both implied and quasi contracts are not concluded expressly, other than this similarity, there is a further difference between these 2 types of contracts, which is why the law distinguishes between these 2 types. So another word for quasi contracts is, by the way, constructive contracts. And remember that constructive is again not the same thing as implied. So yes, the statement is false, because an implied contract is not the same as a quasi contract, and there are differences between these 2 despite the fact that there is also one similarity between them. Now if you're still confused, I'll be happy to explain again and slowly, so do let me know.